Recording in
Hello from wherever you are, and welcome to another session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. The session is available in both French and English, and you can access your preferred language via the globe icon on the bottom left side of your screen. The webinar is also live streamed on the ACA Facebook page and YouTube channel. You can ask questions and leave comments in the discussion box below. This webinar is also made possible because of the support from our partners and sponsors. I would like to acknowledge the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Projects, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Before having our hosts, kindly remember to register now for the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo that will take place from 18th to 22nd of November this year in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Good morning, Jim.
Hi Stella, how are you?
I'm good. How are you too?
Yeah, I'm okay.
We are ready for another update.
Always. I love to talk about cashews. Shall we start?
Yes, Jim, we can start. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Hello everyone. How have you been doing? Interesting times. It's really easy to get caught up in all this stuff about tariffs and trade and all of that. And sometimes we can lose focus, but it's the end of April. We're well advanced in the harvest. Some of them are over. So we're going to talk about some ways to try and put some perspective on what's been going on these last 3 months. So I'm going to talk about markets and crops. I'm going to talk about, I've just called it a vulnerable chain. That's about the African cashew sector and how it fits into the world cashew sector and how vulnerable that is. If you were with us on other occasions, you've probably heard me talk about the dangers in the chain. And I want to talk about how those are today and how they may have got worse over the last 2 or 3 months. And I'll ask the question, is regulation by governments making it worse? Then I thought, okay, let's go a slightly different direction and let's put some perspective on the US market. People talk about it so much, but I often wonder if people really take time to find out where it fits in to the overall market and how important or otherwise the US market is. So we'll have a little look at that too. But let's start where we always start. Let's start with the markets and the general market trends. I'm calling the review of prices as pressure building because I do see a little bit of pressure building in the market, and it's mostly for lower prices. With the good crops still coming in, with easing concerns on Cambodia and India, I'll come back to that in a minute, with the economic uncertainty caused mainly by US trade activity, with the impact of the price rises as we expected in 2025, and with low levels of forward sales, a little bit of pressure is building on prices, mostly on RCN, but also on kernels. On the other side of the ledger, where is the pressure for upward market movement? I was reading this morning, someone said that if there is a settlement on the tariff discussions between Vietnam and the United States, that it could cause upward pressure on prices. Why? I think if there's a settlement, it might actually go the other way, but we'll talk about that a little bit. For higher prices, there's not as much elements of bullish influence. There's lower forward cover than you'd normally expect. Raw cashew nut prices are high, too high maybe, certainly too high related to the price of kernels at the moment. And there is pressure on profit margins. And that might be one element, and it's quite good actually, to see how many processors have resisted the temptation to panic as they did in 2022. Pressure building. Let's have a look at some prices. We'll have a look at general FOB prices. Now, I tend to take the top end of the market. I tend to talk about the prices from the better processors. So if you're seeing lower, that's possible, but be careful with those. I think it's relatively quiet trading. There's maybe been a slight pickup over the last week. Generally, what we used to always call hand-to-mouth buying. In other words, you buy what you need and you take another look. Then you buy what you need again and you take another look till you're finished. I understand that some US buyers are looking or have been looking to buy cargo that will arrive within the 90-day moratorium, and that makes a lot of sense. It also begs the question, what will happen after that? Will they completely withdraw from the market? Will they just bite the bullet, pay the tariff? Most buyers outside of the US are likely to wait and see what's going to happen. So in Europe, in West Asia, North Africa, and in China, buyers will buy what they need, of course, but they may well wait to see the fallout. These trends are tending to follow through to the farm gate. So if you look at the farm gate in West Africa, by the way, we get these prices from the reporters who work with the African Cashew Alliance and the publication AfriCashew Splits, which brings in a market report approximately every 2 weeks, including farm gate prices, international raw cashew nut prices, kernels prices, developments in a range of African countries. As you can see from the table, there is a little bit of downward pressure at the farm gate in Côte d'Ivoire, in Nigeria, in Benin. What you tend to see in these situations is in April, quality tends to decline, certainly in Côte d'Ivoire, certainly in Nigeria. So as quality declines, prices come down too. That partly reflects quality, and sometimes it reflects the market. So sometimes it's not easy to identify, is it the lower quality or is it actually a fall in the market that's causing prices at the farm gate to weaken? I think at the moment it's a mix of the two. We are definitely seeing lower base level prices and we are definitely seeing lower quality. That's not unusual. Quality does tend to decline at this time of year. For example, in Côte d'Ivoire, as the harvest area moves north, the quality tends to decline. That always happens. As you get into the second and even the third flush, you tend to get lower quality. Nothing unusual. What is happening though is that the minimum prices, the government set minimum prices, and that's fairly common across the sector now. Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Burkina, Guinea-Bissau, all these countries have either minimum prices or guide prices, and they're under pressure. How do governments maintain minimum prices? It's not easy, particularly in the raw cashew nut trade. So with processors, they're there all year. They can be just audited, they can be investigated if need be, although that's rare. But in the RCN trade, it's much more difficult. So right now you've got this situation where there is pressure, and in some cases markets are below minimum prices, but they are above the cost of production for farmers. So there may be situations arising now where farmers want to sell, they have the product, but the contradiction between the minimum price and the actual market value as of today slows down trade. And one of the reasons that trade is slowed down is because buyers are just taking their time. And I think that's perfectly logical. Given certain uncertainty about trade, given the crops coming in, it's reasonable to take your time. But we'll look at that a bit more closely. So lower farm gate prices in West Africa, lower quality in West Africa, general softening of prices. We have a look at the international market. So as usual, quick explanation. The red line is an index based on £48, adjusting prices from a range of countries. We're showing 4 or 5 here. It's actually based on 9 different countries. And you can see that if we take a quick calculation of the 320 kernels equivalent price, I won't go into how we do that, but it's essentially based on if you buy, if you process in the most competitive processing destination, which is Vietnam, this is the cost you would get. And as you can see, the equivalent price of kernels is below the current market price of raw cashew nuts and has been throughout this season. So we got this early season high price expectations, followed by relatively slow trade, misalignment of RCN prices with kernels as a result. And now we have the situation where on the one hand, we have continued uncertainty in Vietnam being overwhelmingly an export market, but improving demand in India, which is overwhelmingly a market based on consumption within India, domestic consumption. This contradiction has been there for months and it continues. So we've had a slow start to the RCN season, and let's just think for a moment. Remember, today we're trying to put a bit of context on what's been going on over the past 3 months or so. First thing, particularly for Vietnam, but also for India, is that higher imports from East Africa. Excellent crops in Tanzania and Mozambique. Record crops in both, I think. Therefore, more supplies. Then we get the expectation of larger crops in West Africa and in Cambodia. That was initially bound to slow buyers down too. The unknown impact of kernels prices, we've discussed that several times, and to a certain extent it's still unknown because we're only into April, at the end of April. The expectation of larger crops, the unknown impact of higher prices, caused less forward buying or less confident forward buying than in a typical year. Certainly less forward buying than we saw in 2023 or 2024. Now we get into some of the realities of 2025. First of all, lower kernels exports from Vietnam. I'm going to put some numbers on that in a moment for you. We've seen, as I've just discussed, African RCN out of line with the kernels prices. And the final factor that slowed down this season development is the uncertainty of the tariff regime. A slow start to the season is really impactful in West Africa, potentially causing major problems, because we have the largest producing region in the world with the lowest level of developed post-harvest infrastructure. So if you ask one of the reasons why does quality go down toward the end of the season? Well, yeah, it's partly weather, it's partly varieties, location, but it's also about infrastructure. And the infrastructure comes under greater strain as the year goes on. So what we see as a result is prices are easing. We've seen that at the farm gate, we've seen it in the international market, and quality is easing too, which tends to combine that. There's no resolution yet to the tariff discussion, and that's important. As we'll see, the US market is important, particularly for Vietnam. And then the balancing factor is that the biggest market in the world is beginning to pick up. That's partially seasonal in India. You would tend to see a pickup in demand at this time of year, and processors will want to be able to meet that demand and then replace their inventory with new purchases. But when must they buy? And now we're getting into a little bit of an interesting question, and we're looking at the calendar, looking at the transit times, we're looking at congestion in ports in several countries. We're looking at slow export from Lome, usual problems in Nigeria, We're looking at a certain amount of issues that have arisen in Conakry, for example, and will arise in Bissau. We know that, unfortunately, because they always do. So big question now is, when must processors buy? Where are their agents? Where are their representatives? How active are they? How well are they funded? And what's the next step for them? And they too, those buyers, will be aware that waiting in some cases will mean that they get lower quality. So let's switch then from the slow start to the season and have a look at the situation at destination. So 2 weeks ago we were talking, and we talked about what would be needed for Vietnam to catch up on the import situation as we saw it. So what we were seeing is that Vietnam was well behind import-wise on raw cashew nuts. So at the end of March, the actual number was down 36%, about 165,000 tonnes lower. Question now is, what's happened in the first 2 weeks of April to make that catch up? And what we see is good news, I think. I mean, it's certainly, we asked the question, what does this mean for the Cambodian crop? Well, the signal now is that it meant that it was late, not particularly in trouble. So what we see in the first half of April, that the latest numbers we'll have, next week we should have full April figures. They're really fast in Vietnam and usually pretty accurate. So Vietnam's imports during the first half of April were up by 56% on April of last year. That's about 100,000 tonnes. It can only be that that's driven by Cambodia. If we look at the big picture, then the imports January to the 15th of April, and we compare 2024, which was a pretty good year for imports, as you know, it's only about 3% behind now, 803,000 tonnes compared to 828,000 tonnes. So that's good news. That is something that explains why Vietnamese processors may have taken a little bit more time to get going in West Africa, and the traders that supply them have been a little bit reticent in the market. From this, conclusions from number and from some Cambodia could conclude that the last year, if at all less than last year. Again, as last year, the initial estimate appears to have been a bit overstated. So my money now, if I were to bet on it, would be that the Cambodian crop will be slightly smaller than last year, but not a lot. Let's look at the other side of the picture in Vietnam. We've looked at the imports, looked at the exports. So when we look at our export scenario, we see that yes, the exports are down significantly down for the first 3.5 months of the 17th big drop. Little bit less than 17% in the 12% down. I wouldn't read too much into that. I wouldn't take too much encouragement from that. Maybe one or two things might be a little bit better. China looks a little bit better than when it started the year, but elsewhere people are cautious. So imports down by 12, exports down by the equivalent of about 1,000. I use 22% just as a net outturn. So that's your actual outturn, less processing losses to get to marketable, exportable. Probably a little. That's about processing. Whilst it's not a contrast, it doesn't necessarily change the order in any relevant way. It does see that the situation could be relatively balanced. Let's have a look at the situation in Vietnam. Equivalent of 145,000 tonnes. Imports are not down 25%, they're down 25,000 tonnes. And exports are down by the equivalent of 145,000 tonnes. There were lower openings than in previous years. But bear in mind, in previous years, we probably had a situation where really too much material was carried in, particularly driven by very high imports in 2023. Fewer forward sales, as we've said, international RCN out of line with kernels, and the uncertainty of the tariff regime. You can see how this fits with the delayed season development in West Africa. A lot of the same factors come into play. Where do we go from here? Well, we've seen some buyers either accelerating or buying ahead of the delayed tariff suspension. That makes sense. If you were to believe that a deal of some sort would be struck that wouldn't involve 46% tariffs, you would still trying to get material in to manage your position and to make sure that you're not caught. Later delivery from Cambodia puts a little bit less strain on Vietnamese processors in terms of cash. So there's a more even delivery of the raw material this year. So this should mean that cash flow impact is quite positive for processors. Processors need more raw cashew nuts. We know that. They've 800,000 tons bought. They bought 2.5 million tons approximately last year. So Vietnamese processors need to buy more material. But they're onshore due to the current situation. And as we'll see, the US market is very important for Vietnamese exporters. We know, and it's interesting to see, that lower kernels prices will not solve the problem. So I think even if you dropped kernels prices by 15, 20 cents a pound, I don't think it would change buyers' attitudes to the market at the moment. They're not simply based on price. And I think that that seems to have been taken on board by processors, unlike 2022 and 2023, when there was something of a panic on price and prices were driven down, and buyers did, well, they did what buyers do. They backed away while prices were falling. Lower prices doesn't necessarily mean that buyers will write the contract, pull the trigger on the deal, or move forward. It often means they'll just step back. I think that there is a chance that we will see less processing in Vietnam this year as a result of the tariffs, as a result of the overall lackadaisical demand. That remains to be seen. But if there is less processing, that could actually tighten the supply of kernels. And it could, unusually, cause prices to go up. But that would be much later in the year. So you have two supply chains at play here. You have the raw cashew nut supply chain on the one hand, and you have the kernels supply chain on the other. And sometimes they just move in opposite directions. We don't have a particularly well integrated industry. So you could see a situation where, despite good supplies of raw cashew nuts, even if those prices come down, for reasons of uncertainty and the tariff situation, that you might see less processing in Vietnam. Bear in mind, earlier we talked about profit margins being under pressure, and they have been for years. Looking at the Indian situation, so I'm hearing now that the concerns on the Indian crop are easing a little bit, that a better crop is expected. I've been chatting to a few people. We do see that new crop raw material prices, RCN prices, are a little steadier in India as the market gets off. We mentioned earlier that demand is picking up a little bit. And from what I understand, and this is based not on science, this is based on conversations with various people in different parts of the country. And what I understand is that the crop looks okay. Maybe not the big crop that was originally forecast, but still looking pretty good. Maybe something like 2023, 2022, but better than last year. Interesting enough also in India, bearing in mind India is a consumer of cashews, the biggest consumer of cashews, and bearing in mind it's also a huge market for almonds and it's a huge market for pistachio nuts. Almond prices have been a little bit lower. Demand has been a little bit slack in India. Pistachio prices remain firm. They have been firm for some time. But in the international market, there's some signs that pistachio prices may be just turning downward a little bit. During March and April, prices in Iran were lower. Iran's a major supplier. and that's likely to reflect elsewhere. So that can impact demand for cashews, of course. Lower almond prices might become attractive. If pistachio starts to drop, that might also be attractive. India's imports of RCN, we still only have January, February figures. I will only use the official figures. We saw a few numbers for March and April, which were not particularly encouraging, but they're not official numbers, so I'm not going to quote them here. But we are seeing generally a slowing of imports of RCN, probably based on price, probably based on good opening stocks, good imports from West Africa, particularly Tanzania, and an overall more conservative approach. The Indian rupee having shown a little bit of volatility. Now, the rupee rate is really important for India. If you're Indian, obviously you know that, but elsewhere people may not be conscious of it. As a net consumer, as a net importer of over 1 million tons of raw cashew nuts, which are bought in dollars, sold in Indian rupees, the rate is really important. So it does appear to have settled down a little bit after some volatility. We need to keep an eye on that. That sometimes does stimulate people who are tempted to speculate on the currency movement. They tend to sometimes make some moves in the market. Okay, so outlook. As we look at things, trade is quiet on RCN. RCN prices are a little bit lower, but they're above the kernel's equivalent. Kernel's buyers are waiting for an opportunity. Demand is improving in India, partly seasonal, partly underlying demand. Calendar pressure is building on processors from now on. If you think about it, if you bought something today, when would you get to process that? July? Maybe. So the calendar pressure is beginning to build. Kernel's prices, I'm not saying kernel's prices are weaker or weakening. What I am saying is that the chances of a fall in kernel's prices has increased over the past 2 weeks. We're not going to see the impact of these tariffs or the economic impact of tariffs until the longer term. So we might see, and this is a question that if there was a settlement between the US and Vietnam, for example, would there be a spike in prices? I don't think so. I don't think that would stimulate that at all. In fact, it might even slow buying, depending on the settlement. So you can't judge that one way or the other until you know what the settlement is likely to be. The sentiment generally, I think, in the market over the past 2 weeks has weakened. High costs, the cost of raw cashew nuts, the cost of processing, the cost of logistics are supporting prices, but demand in key markets, European Union, India, China, is holding relatively well. It's relatively resilient based on the fact that our prices are, 70, 90, 85, 90 cents higher than we were per pound a year ago for 320s. Okay, let's have a look at the crops. Let's have a look at the crops. And we're going to have a look in Africa, of course. I'm going to quickly go through the various countries. So what we see in Nigeria, by the way, in Nigeria, there's some content online exaggerating the crop. There's even one post there telling us that Nigeria produces 1 million tons of raw cashews. It doesn't. Be careful what you read online. Unfortunately, in our business, there's just a lot of junk online and you need to be careful of it. So if you're not already aware of this, and I guess most people are, I hope most people are, look out for the numbers. Make sure you check the numbers that you quote. Make sure that you've got some basis for those numbers. From our point of view, what we see in Nigeria is lower quality at this time of year. No surprise there. We see prices easing a little bit at the farm gate, but not easing much. More, easing to reflect quality, not easing to reflect a general weakness in the market. Not much international trade. Prices, I'm quoting a really wide range of prices. Why is that? Because there's a really wide range of qualities available from Nigeria now. I understand that processors have been buying a little bit less than they had hoped. So we might see a fall off in processing from Nigeria this year, which would be disappointing, but understandable in the circumstances. What about Benin? So the crop's coming to a close. Still, it's reported as 200,000 tonnes plus. Over 200,000 tonnes, take your pick. You can see 220, 225. You can even see a forecast of 240,000. I have no idea what these numbers are based on, but I'm pretty sure that it's a good crop. I'm pretty sure it's 200,000 tonnes plus, and that's to the credit of farmers there. Now, things are not good otherwise. The low minimum price, which was set to support processing, together with the export ban, means that the best buyers in the market are probably smugglers today, which is unfortunate. The target that was set for processing in the course of the year, and the capacity is there to do this, the target that was set was about 120,000 tonnes, which would have been a really excellent performance. It seems unlikely to be met now. A lot of material is shifting across the borders. And let's be clear, it's not easy to stop that. It's not easy to police borders anywhere. But particularly if you're talking about small amounts of raw cashew nuts moved by everything from the back of a bicycle through to a truck. So I don't think that that will be met. I've read reports from pretty well-placed people who are telling us that maybe up to 50% of the raw cashew nuts are going across the border illegally. So this is an example of the market reality not in line with the regulation. Where is it going? It's going to Togo, it's going to Nigeria. It's not illegal in either of those countries to import. Of course, it is illegal to import without proper formalities at the point of import. That product will find its way to export markets. In Ghana, the harvest is coming to an end. The second crop probably isn't as good as people had expected in some ways, but you know, it's not as bad as they'd expected either. RCN prices, the minimum or reference price in Ghana is 15 cedis per kilo, and it's above that. It's 15 to 17 at the moment, just above it. That means that there still is material in Ghana. Of course, not all material that comes through Ghana is Ghanaian. Last year, Ghana exported more than double its own crop. Most of that was imported from neighbouring countries. Some of it was imported from Côte d'Ivoire, and some of that was illegally imported from Côte d'Ivoire. Most of it came from the north, from landlocked countries, and flowed through Ghana perfectly normally. Big issues in Ghana with regard to the origin, the identification of origin, big issues with regard to regulation of the sector and how to do that. And there have been some changes there, which I'll discuss a little bit later. Moving on to Togo, crop, domestic crop, it's a small crop, but it looks a little bit lower. Export has started, but slightly stuttered to a start, if I can say that. And there's an influx of product from Benin, as usual, in the last 2 or 3 years. So not a bad picture in terms of production, not an untypical picture for the time of year. 1 or 2 issues, mostly actually around about regulation. Let's move west, and we'll start with the biggest producer, Côte d'Ivoire. The crop moves north, the harvest moves north, lower quality as a result. That's been that way forever. Prices now are, and I'm not sure if they're trading, and they may not be trading, but they're certainly discussed below the minimum price levels. So with an optimistic minimum price level, CFA 425, it's not altogether surprising that there would be pressure on the minimum prices. I'm not sure how that's managed. I know it's not legal to trade below the minimum price, and people should stick to the law, but this is what's talked about in the market. An official report suggested that 900,000 tonnes had already been traded between export and processors. That's 77% higher than the same time last year. Now, if I take that and I take what I hear in the market and I look at prices, I think that perhaps the 1.15 million tonnes official estimate could be much bigger. I think I'm being conservative when I say it could be about 1.35 million. I think it could be more than that. I mean, if you think trade is so far ahead of last year, if you think that processors have already bought up to 400,000 tonnes, according to some reports, and there's even one report that they've bought 600,000 tonnes, although that's not all for export. That's not all for processing. Some of it's got to be for export. This is one of the things in the market. You have a lot of processors that are also trading companies, exporters, so that there's a certain lack of transparency in that. And there's a certain lack of adherence to the spirit of the guidelines. I'm sure people stick to the law, but the spirit of the guidelines, so maybe material bought earlier at higher quality is exported later and not processed in the country. Definitely, despite efforts to control the border, despite news reports of trucks being seized here and there is material crossing into Ghana still. The lower quality, or the quality that's being discussed in some of the border towns in Ghana, gives us clear indication of that. Highly regulated sector, huge sector, with processing and RCN export, a complex situation. Crop looks good. To me, the quality decline at this time of year is perfectly normal. Some issues around about farm gate pricing. What about Guinea? Really up and coming in production. This could be a big crop this year. Arrivals look good. A little bit of concern on the weather earlier in Can region. Seems to be getting a little bit better. To me, despite some logistical issues, this could be a good crop. Export trade relatively steady. Burkina Faso, another regulatory discussion. Export has been, well, I'm using the word suspended. Other people are using the word banned. A ban is difficult to lift. A suspension is easy to lift. That's why I use a different word. Farm gate prices, naturally enough, will be lower. People are telling me, although again, it's gossip, not science, that the RCN buyers' representatives have left the country and gone elsewhere to source products. Doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me that you have such a low proportion of processing in the country that the export of raw cashew nuts would be banned or suspended in order to facilitate buying. Those factories should be able to buy. And some of them are international companies and they should be able to buy quite easily. So you wonder why ban. Guinea-Bissau, again, crop looks good. A few weather concerns knocking around, but it's too early to talk about those. Don't draw too many conclusions from some of the stuff you might have read earlier in the week. This crop, of course, the weather is going to influence it, but don't jump to any conclusions just yet. Slow start to trade, no surprise there. There's been a slow start to trade everywhere. And finally, Senegal, harvest has started. Looks like, as you would normally expect, high quality. That's what you get in Senegal. High prices, high quality. The government has introduced an export tax on raw cashew nuts, which is an interesting development. Previously, Senegal had no regulation of the cashew sector other than basic business regulation. So that's a significant change. It'll be interesting to see if that impacts the farm gate price, because we always have this discussion, who's actually paying the export tax? Is it the processor? Is it the consumer at destination? Or is it actually the farmer? And if you ever want to read about that, there's a lot of academic stuff written on who actually pays export taxes. We will see. We'll be able to we compare prices last year, this year, and it'll give us some indication. Generally then, across West Africa, Not too many problems, certainly less problems than some of the people offering raw cashew nuts would have us believe. Certainly a better crop than last year, I think, and certainly a little softness in prices just now. That could change when buyers come into the market a little bit more aggressively. And particularly people will be looking to Indian buyers for some action in the coming weeks. So overall production review. So I've knocked down our production estimate a little bit. We started this year highly optimistic. We've just moderated that a little bit, but not too much. By my calculations, the optimistic side of our numbers still look like probably a record crop. That's based on improvement in Cambodia, concerns easing in India, good crop in Cote d'Ivoire. Guinea-Bissau, we've moderated our estimate a little bit, but still a good crop. And there's concerns for Burkina Faso and concerns for Benin, and indeed maybe concerns across West Africa, that even though the crop is good, that some of those raw cashew nuts may not make it to market. That hasn't been a situation in recent years, but we did see that fairly common situation some years ago. Certainly a decade ago, leftover stocks in West Africa would not be surprising. So outlook for production. The earlier negative reports appear to be overstated. Looks like things are back on track. Cambodia, crops coming in, definitely some insect damage. I spoke to some commercial farmers there in the course of the week. They're definitely seeing some insect damage, lower than expected yields, but a good crop again. West Africa, early harvesting regions now closing down, quality falling, but as we've said, overall volumes look okay. India, the indicators are better. It's still a little early to draw any serious conclusions about India. What I've heard from the East Coast is that the reports are improving. Generally looks better. So although we've moderated our estimate of the crop, we're still quite positive. And the concern, and this is the biggest concern at the moment, is that some West African material will not make it to market. Overall, fairly optimistic on production. Trade, a little bit hamstrung at the moment by the uncertainty in the international market. We would have had quite a great deal of uncertainty anyway, with such a high increase in prices and reluctance on the part of buyers. And now with this tariff issue introduced by the Americans, obviously that uncertainty is magnified almost to the point where it paralyzes trade. So I want to turn then to the supply chain in general. So we'll just a quick review. So if we look at the supply chain issues in the cashew business, we have a concentration of processing in two countries, in Vietnam and in India. And although African countries like Cote d'Ivoire have shown progress and claim to be the second exporter or the largest processor in Africa, the numbers are really minuscule compared to India and Vietnam. This concentration of processing increases risk and volatility and reduces competition. So does growing far from processing. So if we look at it and we see something like 90% of processing in two countries, we can say that in general, cashew nuts are grown far from where they are processed. We're talking West Africa compared to shipments to Vietnam. This increases the risk, compromises the quality, slows the movement, which we see right now, and increases prices generally because of the additional cost. It also reduces traceability. In fact, it destroys traceability and creates a whole series of environmental costs that wouldn't be the case if those nuts were processed at origin. So I'm not necessarily saying in Africa, I'm saying at origin. So Cambodian nuts in Cambodia, Vietnamese nuts in Vietnam, and so on. And one of the reasons that we have such uncertainty is because of this long chain. Not only does it increase price volatility, but it creates contract risk. contract fidelity risk. So what I mean by that is that people basically don't keep their promises on contracts, and it does risk food safety. Now, we haven't seen too many impacts of food safety, but boy, have we seen impacts on quality. We've seen so much material mixed, shipped, not arriving at the same quality that it was shipped, and so on, and that's down to the long chain. Now introduce this really volatile factor on which we have no resolution yet. So if, for example, let's just imagine that the United States does impose a 46% tariff on Vietnamese cashew kernels. How would Africa cope with that? There isn't enough processing. So would farm gate prices collapse? Would processing development accelerate to meet the demand, to take advantage of the differential in tariffs? Remember, you've got 21% in Côte d'Ivoire as things stand. You have 10 to 14% in other countries as things stand. You've got people making the case that African countries are exempt under various support legislation in the United States. What happens to the Burma kernels trade? Processing development in African countries in the last couple of years became highly dependent on the trade of Burma kernels. Burma kernels trade is sending unpeeled, partially processed cashews to Vietnam, either to be finished or to be traded on as is. Vietnam is not only the biggest customer for raw cashew nuts. In 2024, Vietnam was the biggest customer for cashew kernels through the Burma trade. How would that be impacted if 46% or 21% or 26% tariffs were imposed on Vietnam? Now, that may be unlikely. It's unlikely in my view. I think it'll settle maybe at 10%, but it is a possibility. And even at 10%, it's a serious factor. So we've now introduced into our supply chain vulnerability this new unknown destabilizing factor, which effectively makes, as things stand today, makes Vietnam less competitive, African countries more competitive, but we don't have the processing to the sufficient scale to take advantage of that. So that actually threatens how the whole system works. As if there wasn't enough uncertainty and enough supply chain issues already in existence. So we need to recognize that when we look at this supply chain in 2025, it has changed. A lot of things have changed. Higher prices will hit consumers. We've known that for some time. Normal production, and this is a big crop, this is greater than average, but there is a situation now developing where, similar to the arrival of Cambodia over 2020 through to current time, increased production in Cambodia created a paper surplus, caused a collapse in prices. That was corrected in 2024. What happens next? Last year, we saw a big spike in demand. US imports last year were up 23%. They will not be up 23% this year. That we know. If you look at that, we're looking at a situation where higher prices impacting China, but possibly in India, certainly in West Asia, North Africa, and to a lesser extent in Europe, will slow demand growth. Production growth is not going to slow, and we're heading into a continued surplus position. That's a threat to business too. Adding to that, we're looking at volatility, regulatory volatility. In other words, people change the rules. Governments change the rules, regulators change the rules, sometimes without warning, sometimes without reason too. And this may be undermining buyers and investors' confidence. If you don't know what to expect from the government, in these cases, you may well not enter the market. You may well just stay away. Still getting increasing crops. Cambodia is still growing. Cambodia probably, if all goes according to what's been happening, the trend is that by 2028, Cambodia will have just over 1 million tons of production. That looks certain. Production is still growing in West Africa. Production is growing very quickly in East Africa. Look at Tanzania and Mozambique in the 2024-2025 season. India production is growing more slowly, but it is growing. Other factor, just to introduce it, that the prices of other nuts will also be impacted by tariffs. So if you import almonds, I think it's 72% of the world's almonds come from California. The vast bulk of those are exported, and they will be impacted by retaliatory tariffs in the current situation. They will need to find a market. They will find a market. That might be the US domestic market. And how that plays off against demand for cashew nuts remains to be seen. So you could see a situation where tariffs cause the demand for cashew kernels to improve in India and China, for example, two of the fastest growing markets. But the demand in the United States declines because domestically produced nuts, and I pictured pistachios because I think pistachios have greater potential to have an impact on cashews than almonds do. So if we look at this, so these factors, and we look at the supply chain uncertainty, the situation that was already a difficult situation has become hugely worse over the last 3 months. It could be resolved, it may not be. That's the definition of uncertainty. And it's not good for business. So I wanted to ask the question, is the policy and regulation in African countries, as you can see, is the policy and regulation making the situation worse? The first thing to recognize in that discussion is that there are a wide range of regulatory styles. So we have countries with high regulation, Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, Tanzania. We have countries with moderate regulation. You can see them in orange, Mozambique, Kenya, increasingly Ghana, Burkina, Senegal now. And you have countries with low regulation like Nigeria. So we need to recognize firstly that there is a wide range of regulatory styles. And increasingly there's a wide range of regulations too. So we see, let's go through them quickly, and starting in East Africa. So in Tanzania, we see regulations affecting the access of processors to farmers, to either through the local cooperatives, the AMCOs, or directly to farmers. This impacts processing. We see minimum prices. In some cases, we see lower minimum prices. So the low minimum price in Benin this year is an interesting one. It's intended to stimulate processing, I assume. But contrast that with the high minimum price in Côte d'Ivoire, which is intended to support farmers because processors are supported in other ways. If we look at what has increasingly become a topic of conversation, we see bans on the export of raw cashew nuts. And not only do we see them coming in, we see more countries talking about them. Kenya has the longest ban on raw cashew nuts. In Kenya, during the period of the ban, the production of cashew nuts collapsed. It's coming back a little bit now, but it did have a bad impact. Elsewhere, Benin, we know the story, we'll talk about that in a moment. We've already spoken about Burkina Faso. It's really difficult to see in the current environment of uncertainty how much sense it makes to ban the export of raw cashew nuts. We're seeing increasing regulation even in Ghana, which was known to be a relatively lightly regulated in cashew terms. We saw recently introduced a requirement for export licensing or registration for raw cashew nut exports. Is not altogether clear. That is going to slow down the export. So one of Ghana's big competitive advantages is early good quality crop, highly demanded in India particularly, but also in Vietnam. If you slow that down, you level the playing field for everyone else. Licensing, unless your bureaucracy is quick, and you don't need me to comment on whether the bureaucracy will be quick or not, you're going to slow down exports. So it's a surprising move there. We've seen tax system changes in Guinea-Bissau, which have worked, and I'll use those as an example in a moment. And we've seen, as I mentioned, the introduction of an export tax in Senegal. So in a situation of uncertainty, we get further uncertainty introduced by rapid, sometimes ad hoc, short-term, sometimes not really related to the market, introduction of policies and regulations that often have good logic, but terrible timing, and often very poor communication, so that people really don't know where they stand. I mean, think of the situation from Côte d'Ivoire last year when exports were banned. They were banned for 2 weeks, which turned into 3 months. The communication around that was poor. And it's not only there, these are examples. There are many, many examples. But we'll have a look at a couple of examples. So the first one I want to look at is Guinea-Bissau. So the scenario is that Senegal had up to last year no export tax, and this year a low export tax. Guinea-Bissau has high export taxes and complex domestic trade regulation and taxes, and export by road from Guinea-Bissau is illegal. So what happened was that over a period of time, we saw an increase in cross-border trade. How do we know that? Well, we know that because look at the orange line. That's the export from Senegal, which was recorded in India and Vietnam as origin Senegal. So this actually is the import, but if it's imported, it has to be exported. So we saw this huge increase in the volume exported from Senegal as Senegal origin, but we didn't see a corresponding increase in production. Most people would recognize that. We can also verify it if we look at Guinea-Bissau trade increasing over the years in line with production, and then all of a sudden dives. And Guinea-Bissau exports dive, Senegal exports spike up. And now it's changed. Last year, Guinea-Bissau started to recover the direct exports. So the authorities in Bissau changed the system to incentivize. They had tried restricting export trade at the border. They had squads, they had police, they had roads patrolled. Didn't work. What they did was they started to make it more logical to come to the port of Bissau for export. And it worked. So we have a situation here where, first of all, different policies in neighbouring countries created the informal trade. But a refocus of the policy in one country, at least for now, has resolved the problem. And how do we know that? We know that because we look at the trade statistics related. Example 2, Benin. So look at the chart on the left-hand side to begin with. This is an estimate of production in 2025. The orange is an estimate of processing capacity available in 2025. And the green bar is an estimate of what was actually processed, raw cashew nut volumes, in 2024. So production and processing capacity don't match. Export is banned, and now the supply chain is managed by a public or semi-public organization which is supposed to secure raw material for processors. And a low minimum price was set in order to stimulate processing. But what's happened is that this target won't be met. This product will be smuggled across the border and is being smuggled across the border, and we could well end up at this number are lower in 2025. Now you could say, well, just enforce the ban. Farm gate price, how would you hold the farm gate price if you enforce the ban? Very difficult. What would farmers do if they didn't have outlets for their products? They'd certainly stop looking after their trees. And if you think of the hardship, I mean, we talk about farmers. I mean, farmers are the most important link in the chain, but also the poorest and sometimes the weakest link in the chain. They would suffer, clearly. Their families would suffer. So this regulation is maybe not a bad idea, but maybe introduced 2-3 years too early. Whether it's a good idea or not, time will tell. Right now, the best buyer in Benin is probably a smuggler. They can afford to pay the highest prices. You've got a market at the farm gate based on the minimum price that's at least $100 a ton below what's being paid for a much lower quality product in Côte d'Ivoire, for example. So what I'm saying is that policy is creating greater vulnerability through its implementation. Maybe good ideas, not necessarily at the right time or communicated properly. Is this supply chain becoming more vulnerable? We know that the supply chain, and I'm talking the global supply chain and how it impacts Africa, we know it's more vulnerable to buyers' needs in terms of sustainability, traceability, buyers' requirements, and the more complex logistics needed to move 2.5 million tons of raw cashew nuts halfway around the world and then move the kernels back. Secondly, we know that Vietnam is vulnerable to tariffs. We know that if we extract the US market element, that's about 950,000 tons, of which, just on the broad calculation, of which about 500,000 is African origin, but also impact Cambodia, cashews grown in Vietnam, but mostly it will impact African origin cashews if that happens. And we know that African processors in most countries are highly dependent, or some of them are highly dependent, Burma kernels sales to Vietnam. So this means that it impacts not only the trade in raw cashew nuts, but it impacts the ability of processors to make money, ability of processors to continue processing at a capacity that justifies their activity. So is the supply chain becoming more vulnerable? The answer is yes, and 2 reasons. Firstly, greater dependence on exports of raw cashew nuts. Secondly, greater dependence on Burma kernels. And of course, finally, question still to be resolved, the impact of US tariffs. What about, is policy and regulation making this situation worse? And I would say yes, it is, particularly ad hoc policy. So I'm not talking about the broad range of policy. What I'm talking about is short-term changes in policy that impact the market. And I think that may well have undermined buyers' confidence and possibly contributed to not only the delayed export season, but also to investor activity in West African countries. Bans of raw cashew nuts add to the problem, except in cases where there's enough processing in place or enforcement of the bans are in place. If you don't have enough processing or you can't enforce the ban, it's definitely going to create greater vulnerability and uncertainty in the chain. My conclusion on this would be that unpredictable policy and short-term measures are increasing risk. Longer-term measures, and there are some excellent policies and some excellent regulatory measures. Export tax on RCN is not a problem. Supporting processors is not a problem. But some of these unpredictable and short-term activities are, and it's not the right time to be doing that given the overall uncertainty in the chain. Okay, let's have a look at our final element today. Just to put some context on the discussion around tariffs and trade, how important is the US market for cashew kernels? Yeah, it's important. There's no doubt. So if we just look at natural raw cashew kernels consumption in 2024, about 17% is in North America. Obviously, the lion's share of that in the United States. So yes, it is an important market. In terms of consumption, it's number 3 after Europe and India. In terms of imports of kernels, it's a little bit further up than that. So let's have a look at those. Generally speaking, the US market has been growing slowly for imports of natural cashew kernels. So I've got 2 numbers here. You got the blue bars, that is the imports of what we call cashew kernels, and then you've got the gray bars, which is the imports of what we call processed cashew kernels. These might be roasted or processed in some way. And you can see there's fast growth on those, but still a long way behind the natural cashew kernels imports. If you look at the overall trend, you see pretty steady growth, big dip in 22, 23, economic impact in 2022, 23. So that impacted the natural kernels, and then a big increase last year. Some of that, of course, was to do with building inventories ahead of this tariff discussion, which we're seeing now. Where do Americans buy their cashew nuts? Well, overwhelmingly in Vietnam, over 89% in Vietnam, only 7% from Africa, which is the number 2 region for supply. If we look at the growth rates, so this is an interesting thing here. If you look at the trend to 2024, you're going to see growth rates over 10 years of 3%, over 5 years almost 4%. But if you look to 2023, in other words, taking out this big increase in 2024, which doesn't appear to be reflected in the demand at the consumer level, you get a much lower growth rate, something like 2% over 10 years. And if you look at that for natural cashew kernels, less than half of 1%. But for processed, although they're at a much smaller volume, pretty fast growth, around 13%. Now, I'm not sure if that's a trend that will continue, but it is certainly an interesting trend. So the US market is mature, it's growing slowly, and there is a change toward more processed products. Very high dependence on Vietnam. And to be noted, and this is one of the things that's sometimes overlooked, the US market is very important for its use of broken kernels and scorched kernels. Market share might be 20 to 25%, depending on the year. So the big spike in 2024, after 2 fairly poor years, appears to have been inventory building. Because when we look at retail demand, we see it's up about 7%. When we look at imports, we see them up 24%. So this remarkable growth may have been inventory building. If it is, it will impact on the 2025 imports. So when it comes to cashews, the US market is actually quite old-fashioned. There's not much innovation in supply, there's not much diversification of supply, but there is innovation in product usage. What about Africa? How much cashews does Africa supply to the United States? Well, it's been increasing. It's been increasing quite nicely in recent years. And if we look at the growth, so you've got here, you've got market share in percentage, and we see that that's around 7.09%. Mind you, if you go all the way back to 2014, it was around 6%. And then you've got growth in volume. So you see growth in volume is much higher. That's because the market's been growing. So when the market overall increases, the growth in volume increases, but the share doesn't necessarily increase. So what we can see is that the volumes increased in line with the market growth, but the actual market percentage has been relatively stable over the years. If we look at which African countries are supplying, well, no real surprise, 67% of US imports from Africa come from Cote d'Ivoire. That's pretty much in line with the percentage of African processing that's done in the country. Benin has been moving up last year. I think it was 2,200 tons. Big improvement there. Ghana, probably mostly from Uzibras, and Nigeria from a range of different factories. So we're seeing a couple of changes, but generally, as you'd expect, Cote d'Ivoire dominates that market, and that's likely to increase. So we would hope if processing in Benin gets going this year, that will increase. I'm pretty sure Tanzania only has 1%, but I'm pretty sure in 2025 there'll be more shipments from Tanzania to the US market. So the US market is interesting, but not really that hugely important to African processors yet, but it should be. Let's have a look at buyers' requirements. Is that the reason why African processors haven't made as many inroads there as they have in Europe, for example? Well, we can note various things. First of all, we can note that importers have a big role to play in the US market still, much more than they have in Europe. We can note that the food safety is important. The quality management systems and compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act, amongst others, are key drivers. Probably the requirements are not as stringent as the European market, for example, but more stringent than other markets, like the Middle East, for example. Price is a key factor. I mean, price is a driving force, and this is why Vietnam continues to dominate the US market, because, simply put, they're cheaper. All grades are used in the US, and what we also see is that the market has become more concentrated in terms of the number of players through mergers and acquisition, which is that's quite an interesting trend, and that may be one of the reasons why we get surges in buying and then a quiet period to follow. But as you can see, that you have multiple channels, not as structured as the European market. The European market would have a much simpler structure, less ingredients, more private label packing, less branding, less ingredients in Europe, lower role for the importer, but in the US all of those things are there. It's a huge country, it's a huge market, of course. Let's have a look at the US market in the very big picture. So in terms of the US share of world consumption, just expressing that in percentage terms, it's now here down around 15%. So the percentage of consumption that the US market involves is lower now than it was 10 years ago. That's because of relatively slow growth in the US and fast growth elsewhere. That's consumption. Now, if we take out consumption and just look at imports, so we're talking now about imports of cashew kernels, we'll see that the figure is higher. So the US accounts for about 29% of world imports. So India, for example, is out of this picture because India imports raw cashew nuts. Here we're talking about imports of kernels. That's why the percentage share goes up. So about 1/3 of the world's imports are in the US market. And that's reflected in Vietnam. The US is really important, and the US share of Vietnam's exports is increasing. So the US is about 27% of Vietnam's exports. Now you can imagine when processors in Vietnam look at that and they think, we've got 27% of our exports and we're going to find that there's an additional cost on that, maybe 46%, that has to be paid. It's not going to be paid by the Vietnamese processor or by the farmer. It's going to be paid by the American consumer. How will the American consumer react to such an increase in price? And that's why, although the US is diminishing in its importance in the world market, which probably reflects a lot of other sectors too, it is increasing in its importance in Vietnam. That has an impact on Vietnamese processors, but it has an impact also on African producers whose goods are processed in Vietnam for export to the US. So let's have a look at the overall outlook over the coming weeks. And this is the way I'm seeing it as we get to the very last day of April 2025. I think that the RCN market is a little bit paralyzed. As I've said, prices look a little bit weaker. We've got delayed decision making, which tends to weaken prices because of the situation on the trade tariffs. Buyers are buying carefully. I think buyers of kernels and raw cashew nuts are buying carefully, but you have seen a little bit of a spike on US kernels. Meantime, on the production side, crops, the outlook over the last 2 weeks has come a little bit more into close focus. It's not as big as we thought back in February, but it's not as bad as some people have been saying about Cambodia and India. The prices generally in the market don't suggest a problem, but RCN prices are definitely mismatched with kernels. Probably it's the raw cashew nuts are too high. As I was saying earlier, I feel that kernels are more likely to go down than to go up in the short term, which confirms the idea that RCN is overpriced right now. For me, if I were a buyer, I would say I'm going to buy based on the calendar. I'm going to take my time. I'll buy what I need for when I need it. I won't take too many long-term decisions for now. I'll wait and see. And I will be careful that I don't base my long-term decision making on these short-term factors. Ideally, we would see a resolution or clarification on the trade situation for the United States, and the market can go back to what is a period when production is increasing, demand is increasing, but we're probably in a situation of oversupply at different points in the year. So interesting times. I don't see a huge amount of activity in the next week. And by the way, we're going to be back with you next week in a different development. We're going to have 2 weeks in a row. But for now, let's go back to Stella and let's see if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Jim. Yes, we have a couple of questions. The first one is related to the US traffics on Vietnam and Cambodia. What is your prediction for when the 90-day pause runs out? Are these processors and their US buyers rushing to get their shipments out before the tariffs are reimposed, given the US exposure to Vietnamese supply? How will this affect prices in the short term?
Well, I'll give you an opinion, but let me say this. I'm not an expert on international economics or international trade policy, but my gut feeling is that food products will end up being at the very much lower end of this tariff regime. It won't go away, but it will be down at the lower end. It's interesting to note in the case of Vietnam, that Vietnam is an important supplier, not only of cashews, but a whole range of foodstuffs, including fresh foods, to the United States. And it's also interesting to note that in the first quarter of the year, imports by Vietnam of foodstuffs from the United States have increased. So I don't think the target of this is coffee or cashews or cocoa. I don't think the target is rice or spices. I think the target of this is technology and manufacturing. And for that reason, I think that there will be some form of resolution on food, but it will of course be used as a bargaining chip. So that means anything can happen. And this is all about negotiation. This is all about a deal. Whatever you think about the way international governments and peoples should behave toward each other, this is about a deal. And that's the rules that are set out there. I'm optimistic, in other words, but we need to watch this quite closely. Stella.
We have a follow-up question. How IVC processors are getting good price on WW320, similar to Indian price of WW320. As the quality parameters of IVC cashew kernels appears to Indians' cashew quality standards.
That's a really really interesting question. Um, they are some, not all, some processors in Ivory Coast are getting higher prices because of their quality, because of their sustainability approach, because of their certification, and because of their location. Those are the four main factors. So particularly for the European market, buyers will look at not only Ivory Coast, but West Africa generally as an origin where they can buy traceable, sustainable, high quality products. Those products are not at the same level of quality as Indian cashew kernels would be. Indian cashew kernels would be, generally speaking, superior to those produced in West Africa. But West African cashew kernels, generally speaking, are superior to those that are shipped from Vietnam. Where you do find cashew kernels that match Indian quality is in Tanzania, for example, potentially in Benin, potentially in Ghana, which would closely match the quality. So it is quality, but it's not just quality. It's a whole mix of factors. And it is interesting, we're seeing, if today we set Vietnamese prices, let's say at 330, the top quality products from African processors are selling at 360 plus, 365, 363. And the next step down is somewhere in between. So well organized, well certified, well marketed, and sometimes people have the advantages without realizing it, so they don't market in that way, are definitely getting higher prices. They're not quite close to Indian prices. Indian prices are way above that again. Some Tanzanian processors, certified BRC processors, are making similar prices to Indian kernels in the Gulf states. But generally speaking, you've got three tiers. You've got Vietnam, you've got top African, and then you've got somewhere above that Tanzanian and Indian, together focused on certain markets. So it is worth investing in quality and certification, and it is worth concentrating on marketing if you're a processor in Africa, because premium prices are there to be had. Stella?
Jim, tell us, who is really benefiting from the policy regulations beyond the export taxes? Are the factors really benefiting from the regulations?
I guess we're talking about export bans in this question.
Yes.
In theory, factories should be benefiting from that. They should find it easier to buy at a price that's reasonable. Now, we've just been talking about premium prices for cashew kernels. So if factories are able to get premium prices for cashew kernels, then they should be able to pay farmers a reasonable price. So I think that the bans are, unless you've got processing at a capacity that is approaching to match the crop, by banning the export, you're creating an artificial surplus in the country that doesn't benefit anyone. And in the long term, it could impact processors negatively, because it could impact production or quality of the product negatively over the longer term. So if we look at the situation today and we say, look at some countries where they have a period, a window, if you like. Look, Cote d'Ivoire has it, Ghana has it, Mozambique has it, and it's quite a good strategy, so that for a few weeks of the year, processors have exclusive access to the supply chain, and they can buy without competing with the export market. That benefits processors without necessarily damaging farmers. In a way, it shouldn't be necessary, because the processors should have built enough linkages to farmers to secure their supplies anyway. but that hasn't happened yet, so it is necessary. The outright ban for the entire season causes this artificial surplus. The product must go somewhere. We know where it goes. It goes across the border illegally. So the government loses export taxes. The processors do not get access to the product. Prices are less predictable. So generally speaking, it does appear that the bans, unfortunately, are not really benefiting anyone right now. If you're in a situation, let's say more close to the Kenyan situation, where your ability to process can match your crop, that's a different matter. But if you're in a situation where your production greatly exceeds your ability to process, I don't think it's a ban that makes sense. So, I mean, who's benefiting is hard to say. You know why governments do it. You know the positive motivation behind it is to stimulate processing. The thinking may be, well, okay, we have to take some years of difficult times in order to achieve our goal. But at the same time, that could damage production, and it certainly will slow the growth in production. So who benefits is not easy to answer. My initial thinking is nobody. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. Still on exports. This question is with regards to licensing of exporters in Ghana. Will, in this case, the licensing of exporters rather not lead to streamlining of the market and improve on buyers' practices?
Why would it? I mean, because you're licensed, does that mean you do business differently? If the licensing isn't accompanied by an overall regulatory framework, then it just is bureaucracy. So I don't think that licensing of exporters, which probably is intended to restrict the activities of foreign companies in the supply chain, but that's never worked anywhere because foreign companies just align with domestic companies and do their business. So you've got a remarkably difficult situation in Ghana from a regulatory point of view. You have, on the one hand, production of highly valuable, high quality, raw cashew nuts that arrive at great time of year. But you've also got a sector that's highly dependent on transit trade, and that is also a great opportunity. Some of the transit trade is exported as Ghanaian, probably most of it. Some of the domestic production should be processed in the country, but processors find difficulty accessing it. I don't think that we've heard the last of regulatory developments in Ghana, but I don't see that the licensing itself will have any impact in streamlining the trade. Quite the contrary, it will create bureaucracy, probably slowing down the trade. That would be experience from elsewhere. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. DHL has only stopped parcel deliveries at above $800, citing delays from US customs bureaucracy relating to the application of new tariffs. Have you picked such delays from Vietnamese cashew kernel exporters?
No, haven't heard anything like that.
Thank you, James. Someone is asking if you could briefly go through the North American cashew kernel buyer requirement slide once again.
Okay, well, I mean, to access the North American market, you need to be competitive on price. You need to be adhering to strict food safety regulations, a minimum of a HACCP system in place, ideally more than that. You need to be registered in advance as a factory. An importer or an agent will help you with that. You need to have a good quality product, obviously, and you need to have all of those basic food safety procedures in place. So the American regulations are intended to protect American consumers, just as they are everywhere, from infected or dangerous foodstuffs. And if you do that, if you register, if you prepare your documents in compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. If you have a food safety program in place in your factory, if you have a quality management system, minimum a HACCP system in place, you should be in position to access the US market. The next thing you need to do is to be careful as to choose the right channel. So do you want to work with an importer? Do you want to work with an agent or a broker in the country? Do you want to work with a processor directly? Working with an importer might have the advantage of allowing you to sell all different grades because they will talk to different customers, and you might get some good market information back, and the management of the relationship with the end buyer is done by the importer. If you work directly with the roaster, you might find that you won't be able to sell all of your grades to that particular roaster. You might need more than one. You may well have to work a little bit more on the customer relationship management with direct business than using an importer. And you might find that your, should we say, your opportunities are limited because most roasters will buy a few times a year, whereas an importer will be in business every day. There's a lot to accessing the US market. What I haven't mentioned is good marketing and communication. It's very interesting. I think there are a few publications. I know we've done a few workshops on that. You might find those online. If you're interested, get in touch and I'll give you some guidance on where you might find some information. So.
Thank you, Jim, for going back. Still going forward with our questions. When you say buyers should wait out for when to buy when it's required, isn't that risking lower quality as the weeks progress?
Well, I guess we're talking about raw cashew nuts. The quality of kernels shouldn't change. Yeah, that's true. You might be risking lower quality as weeks progress. But if the good quality isn't moving and it's in secure hands, it shouldn't get too much worse, so to speak, if you're focused on certain markets. But if you were focused on Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, the Gambia, you wouldn't really be risking lower quality. If you're focused on Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and that's the decision to make, does that price quality balance justify itself? So if you think the market is going to fall by only $25 a ton, but that the quality outturn might fall by £3, then there's no point in waiting. If you think that the outturn might shift by £1 or £2, but the price rather might drop by $150 a ton, we don't know what's happening. We don't know until we get some resolution on the trade discussions where it will go. And you take a risk. Now, if you're in India, it's probably a little bit less of a risk because you know your domestic market and you know the likely behavior in the domestic market. If you're in Vietnam, buying raw cashew nuts or anywhere else, it's a little bit more tricky because you're dependent on the international market, which is in turn, to a certain extent, dependent on the US market. So good point. There's a balance to be struck. Everyone does what they think is the right thing for their own business. And that's the important thing. And what I'm saying, I'm not suggesting to speculate. I'm suggesting to carefully observe the market and manage your risk. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. There is a question with regards to difficulties faced by production in 2025. You didn't give further details, the participant says. Could you please share more on the difficulties ahead of production for 2025 so we can find solutions to improve productivity?
I didn't really talk about problems on production in 2025. I see production as moving forward quite well. So yes, obviously there's lessons to be learned, but I'm quite positive on production. And what we're talking about, and let's just go back to that for a moment. But what we sometimes talk about is the changes in forecasts. So we started with just looking at this slide, we started with the very optimistic estimate of the 2025 crop. It was up here about 5.8 million tonnes. We've tapered that back a little bit because the Cambodia volume is a little bit less. Now, the problem in Cambodia has been that the weather hasn't been as kind as would normally have been expected. There was also a similar situation in Vietnam. So Vietnamese production, starting out with a good crop, has eased back a little bit. In India as well. So the main issues in the course of the year have been the weather. Now there's not much we can learn. The weather is an impactful factor. We always knew that. But it's not much we can do about the weather. We just have to follow the trends. What we can do in the longer run is start to look at the impact of climate change and start to look at how to mitigate the impact and the risks involved in climate change. Now, those involve perhaps changing the methods of production, and those involve maybe in the long run planting different kinds of cashew trees, different varieties, looking for varieties that are more climate resilient. So I would say that if we talk about difficulties this year, what we're talking about is changes in weather patterns related to climate change. The lesson we can learn is, let's look at the impact of climate change, let's measure it and see what can be done. I think in a lot of countries that is very much on the agenda. It's a very good question, thank you. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. The same participant goes on with a follow-up question on productivity. He said that you made the observation that 2023 was a better year in terms of productivity. Wouldn't it be a good idea to carry out a comparative study to identify the factors that led to better production in 2023?
Well, you can look at it lots of different ways. You could say we look at 2023 as the record crop, or we look at 2024 as not so good a crop. Which one do you look at? I think you look at them all. I think you have to look at the trend in production over many years. But we do know, and there is some good work done, not least by organizations like Move Comp Cashew, for example, among others, which identifies key issues as post-harvest handling, harvesting, tree management, the general husbandry, and improving those areas will improve yields. Factors, look in Cambodia as a good example. So a lot of those factors are very well managed in Cambodia and yields generally are very high. But there is a vulnerability, as everywhere, to climate change. So we have to distinguish what's climate change impact, what's practice. If as was identified many years ago, the biggest way we can impact production and farmers' livelihoods is to improve yields. And in cashews, the best way to improve yields is to improve on-farm practice and management of the trees, which presents some presents some great difficulties, because sometimes in order to improve for the longer term, farmers may have to be helped to manage shorter term drops in yields. They may have to consider taking out some of the trees if they're overly densely planted, for example. It may be just much simpler, like proper pruning, use of inputs, proper post-harvest handling. So there's a whole range of things. I don't think simply comparing one year with the other is going to give us the answers, but I do think that continued research in this area, which is already quite well researched, to me, what's lacking here is not so much the research and the comparisons and the reasons. What's lacking here is the resources to implement improved production for farmers. Just planting more trees every year is not really a sustainable solution to increasing production or productivity. We're going to have a session in June, by the way, on talking about farmers and farming of cashews. And we're going to be joined by a very interesting guest. And we're going to talk about the question, are we paying farmers enough attention, or are they neglected in the chain. So join us for that. That's going to be June, I think it's June 11th. You'll hear a bit more about that in the coming sessions. Stella, back to you.
Thank you, Jim. We have another question on the new custom rates in the US. The participants would like to know, in view of the current kennel market and the new custom rates in the USA, is it worthwhile for new entrants to invest in setting up a processing plant in Cote d'Ivoire?
That's a huge question. I don't think that the changes in tariffs should discourage anyone from investing in cashew processing at this time. It is a big factor. So let's consider, we've put some context on this. The US market is about 29% of world imports of cashew kernels. That's important. Cote d'Ivoire is a supplier to the US, but not a major supplier to the US. So at this moment in time, a loss of exports to the US, if that were to happen, would not have a major impact. Would a tariff of 46% reduce demand in the US? I guess it would. Would a tariff of 10% reduce demand in the US? Well, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, and if you were there at that session, you'll know, in my opinion, it won't make any difference. Remember, our market goes up and down 15, 20% year to year. That's quite common. It hasn't damaged the overall projection for demand. So I do not think that a 10% tariff is going to have a seriously negative impact on demand. And I think it will settle at 10%. Cote d'Ivoire currently has a 21% tariff, so that would be reason to reconsider where to locate a process. But again, I wouldn't be at all surprised if that ended up more like 10% than 21%. It seems somewhat ridiculous that a wealthy country like America is taxing developing countries on their food exports. So no, for the time being, I would say no. I would say it is important, however, when you look at your processing, to look at which market you're going to target. And if your initial concept was that we're 100% looking at the US, that might change the dynamic a little bit. But if we think in the long run, and we have seen that US demand is growing, but growing only very slowly, except for last year, and we look at other markets where we see fast growth, there is an opportunity for cashew kernels over the longer term to grow. So no, except if your target market is the US, in which case then I'd be pausing and waiting to see how the negotiations turn out. Sana.
Thank you very much, Jim. Like you mentioned earlier, we'll be back next week. What should we expect?
So next week, because we're going to do 2 sessions in rows, I want to do something a little bit different. So what I'm going to do next week is I'm going to look at a 10 years on, I'm calling it, or 10 years after. And what we're going to look at is a scenario 10 years after what the cashew sector might look like in 2035. So I'm going to have a look at where demand might go, where production might go, what the market might look like in terms of processing in Africa, in Vietnam, in India, and demand in markets like the US, as we've been discussing, Europe and China. So something a little bit different. We'll have a little talk about markets. If there's any big developments in the week, we'll talk about markets. But I thought, here's an opportunity. 2 sessions in a row. Let's do something a little bit different.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you for today, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Thanks, everyone.
I will also take the opportunity to thank our partners and sponsors, the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Cashew, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Also be reminded to register for the 19th AC Annual Cashew Conference and Expo and enjoy a 40% discount on all conference rates if you register before August 31st. Until next week, enjoy the networking platform. Bye.
Bye-bye.
En Afrique et en Asie, augmenter la compétitivité des produits finis tout en réduisant la facture énergétique grâce à la valorisation de biomasse représente un enjeu économique majeur pour les pays